Hey guys, tonight we step into the dust-soft hush of ancient Sumer, where moonlight touches broken walls, reed beds lean beside black water, and clay tablets wait like patient little traps for anyone curious enough to read them. You are standing in the world of scribes' canals, temple towers and old arguments pressed into mud, and the topic drifting toward you tonight is a careful one, a hidden conflict that some readers think continued long after the Anunnaki departed, if departed is even the right word. Some parts are widely accepted, history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what-if imagination. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Historians debate archaeology, suggests, and the texts themselves might offer clues, though not neat answers wrapped with a ribbon. You probably would not survive this world very gracefully, by the way, not because of cosmic doom, but because one bad harvest, one angry official, or one mosquito-filled canal evening, and you would be begging for modern plumbing in about 6 minutes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin where so many Sumerian mysteries begin, not with thunder, not with glowing portals, not with anything that would make a streaming platform clutch its pearls, but with clay, damp clay, thumb-smoothed clay, sun-dried and kiln-baked clay, small rectangles, and pillows of earth covered in wedge marks. Archaeology suggests that these tablets preserve one of the earliest writing systems in human history, developing in southern Mesopotamia in the late 4th millennium BCE. What's broadly accepted is that writing first grows here out of practical needs, counting grain, tracking sheep, managing labour, recording offerings. Very glamorous. The first great literary civilization begins in part because somebody had to keep inventory. Humanity, as usual, invents transcendence and bureaucracy at nearly the same time. And yet, once you move beyond the lists and receipts, something stranger stirs. The texts do not simply count things. They remember, they justify, they praise, they warn, they imagine. One interpretation is that later Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts preserve a memory of instability that feels larger than ordinary politics, as if conflict did not vanish when divine figures became less immediate in the stories but changed form and settled into the human world instead. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The evidence does not show a neat secret war continuing in plain sight. The evidence does, however, suggest a culture deeply concerned with order, disruption, rivalry, legitimacy, and the uneasy distance between heaven's will and human reality. That distance matters, because when modern readers hear the word Anunnaki, all sorts of dramatic furniture gets dragged into the room. A popular rumour claims they were literal visitors who ruled the earth and left behind hidden programs, bloodlines, or unfinished plans. This theory is not widely accepted, but it lingers because the name itself sounds heavy and mysterious, like a stone door in a cave. Most historians agree that, in the actual textual tradition, the Anunnaki are divine beings within Mesopotamian religion, their roles shifting somewhat across time, genre, and city. They belong to the mythic and theological universe of the texts, not to a modern science fiction screenplay wearing a fake beard. If we treat the more extravagant claims as a possibility rather than a conclusion, they remain bedtime fog, not firm ground. Still, even on firm ground, the atmosphere can feel eerie. You are in a land where cities rise from mud brick and labour, where temple towers catch the first light, and where survival depends on cooperation that is always at risk of breaking down. The southern Mesopotamian plain is rich but fragile. Agriculture depends on irrigation. Canals must be dug, cleared, repaired, watched. Water is life, but it is also an argument waiting to happen. Too much water and the fields drown. Too little and they crack. A canal redirected upstream can turn theology into a shouting match by lunchtime. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states competed over resources, borders and influence. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur. These are not sleepy little villages holding hands in the moonlight. They are proud urban centres with temples, rulers, workers and rival claims. A careful reading might suggest that this practical world of competition creates the emotional background for later stories of divine tension and lingering disorder. In other words, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the hidden conflict is not a single secret event, but a long inheritance of strain, remembered through religion, poetry and political language? We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. One clue is the way Sumerian literature talks about order as something precious and vulnerable. The world does not feel naturally stable in these texts. It feels arranged, maintained, negotiated, kept upright through right relations between gods, kings, temples and communities. When that order phrase disaster follows, archaeology suggests that floods, Salinization warfare, and dynastic turnover all shaped life in Mesopotamia. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that knew perfectly well how quickly things could unravel. One year, the storehouse is full. The next year, the grain is thin, the workers are restless. The neighbour city is suddenly very interested in your canal, and somebody in authority is claiming divine approval with suspicious enthusiasm. You can almost smell the setting now: wet reeds, warm mud brick, barley mash, smoke from cooking fires, bitumen, sheep, human nerves. A scribe sits cross-legged with damp clay and a cut reed stylus trying to impose neat wedges on a world that refuses to stay neat. And somewhere behind that patient administrative order is a recurring sense that human beings are managing something inherited, not invented from scratch. Sumerian kings often present themselves as restorers, builders, chosen caretakers. That alone is not mysterious. Ancient rulers love to say they are tidying up after chaos. It is practically their hobby. But one interpretation is that the language of restoration may also preserve a cultural memory that order once felt closer to the divine, and later had to be maintained by exhausted humans with ledgers. Historians still argue whether these themes should be read mainly as theology, as political ideology, or as reflections of lived instability. The honest answer is yes, all of the above, with a few missing pieces, and a lot of cautious footnotes nobody reads for fun. There is no full consensus, because the texts are layered, the chronology is long, and later cultures preserve older ideas while reshaping them. A myth written down centuries after its earliest roots may carry several ages inside it at once. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. So imagine, only gently, a late evening in a Sumerian city. The canal water darkens, the temple precinct cools. Somewhere a priest recites, somewhere a labourer snores, somewhere a dog gives one offended bark, because history is happening and nobody asked his permission. The gods of old stories still have names, still have temples, still have claims, but the weight of daily order falls heavily on human hands. If there was a departure, it may not have meant disappearance. It may have meant distance. It may have meant that divine conflict, once narrated above, now echoes below in politics, labour, memory and fear. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. And the first tablet does not shout its answer. It only invites you closer into a world where clay remembers strain long after voices fade, and where the silence after the gods may be the loudest clue of all. The silence sits with you a little longer now, like dust on your sleeve, while the landscape of southern Mesopotamia slowly sharpens into focus. You are no longer just holding a tablet in your mind. You are standing inside the world that produced it, in a land so open and flat that the sky can feel less like a ceiling and more like a supervisor. Dawn comes wide here, heat rises early, reeds whisper beside the marshes, insects stage a tiny opera you never bought tickets for, and the canals cut through the earth like lines on a palm. Archaeology suggests that the cities of ancient Sumer grew in this alluvial plain through careful irrigation, communal labour, and constant adaptation. What's broadly accepted is that this was one of the earliest urban civilizations on Earth, and that its great cities did not exist in dreamy isolation. They existed shoulder to shoulder, sometimes trading, sometimes competing, sometimes glaring at each other across disputed fields as if somebody had stolen the moon. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states depended on a delicate balance of land, water, labour, and divine legitimacy. A city was not just a cluster of houses, it was a temple system, an economic machine, a political claim, and a sacred geography all at once. Uruk had its long prestige, Ur its royal strength, Nippur its spiritual importance, Lagash and Umma their famously prickly relationship. If you want a gentle bedtime reminder that civilization is complicated, this is a good one. Even some of the earliest cities on Earth were already dealing with water rights, border tension, and leaders insisting they had the heavens on speed dial. And that is where the hidden conflict begins to feel less like a dramatic secret and more like a durable condition of life. A careful reading might suggest that later stories about divine order and divine distance grow out of these practical human pressures. If the world depends on canals, and canals depend on cooperation, and cooperation depends on people who are tired, ambitious, proud or terrified, then conflict is never far away. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if old references to divine tension, or to the consequences of divine withdrawal, echo the daily reality of humans, inheriting a system that always feels one cracked embankment away from trouble? The evidence we do have points clearly to competition between cities. One of the best known examples comes from the long conflict between Lagash and Umma, remembered in inscriptions such as the Stele of the Vultures from the early dynastic period. This is mainstream history, not bedtime fog. Boundary disputes were real. Irrigation access mattered. Fields mattered. Canal lines mattered. In a landscape where agriculture depends on managed water, a border is never just a border. It is grainwork status offering survival. Archaeology suggests that even slight changes in irrigation control could alter the fortunes of a community. So when rulers speak of restoring rightful boundaries, they are not only making theological statements, they are talking about food taxes and who gets to sleep without panic tonight. One interpretation is that this recurring struggle over earthly order creates the emotional grammar for later myths of cosmic disorder. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But it helps explain why Sumerian thought often feels so concerned with balance, assignment, role, and legitimacy. Everybody has a place. Every god has a sphere. Every city has its patron. Every canal has a direction. And when any of that arrangement slips, the whole system seems to wobble. You can feel it in the city itself. The temple precinct rises above the houses, reassuring and slightly intimidating. Like a giant reminder that your grain account is visible to both heaven and management. Storehouses hold barley. Workshops turn out textiles, tools, ceramics. Officials measure record a sign. Workers move in teams. Boats carry goods through the canals. Fish reeds dates wool and grain all feed the urban rhythm. What's broadly accepted is that temple and palace institutions played central roles in organising labour and resources, though the exact balance between them shifts across periods. Historians still argue whether early Sumerian cities were primarily temple-centred systems that later evolved towards stronger palace power, or whether those categories were always more entangled than our neat diagrams imply. That debate matters because authority in Sumer is never merely practical. It is sacred, or at least presented that way. Kings do not simply rule, they build for gods, restore order, defend boundaries, sponsor rituals, and claim rightful alignment with divine expectations. The human ruler becomes the visible hinge between heaven's design and earth's mess. Very convenient. For the ruler, of course, ancient kings and modern executives have this in common. Both enjoy describing their own paperwork as destiny. Still, even when the official language is grand, the underlying stress remains human. You need water at the right time. You need labourers to show up. You need neighbouring cities not to seize what they think you do not deserve. You need scribes to count honestly, which is perhaps the most speculative element of the whole evening. A more cautious explanation could be that what later readers interpret as a hidden post-Anunnaki conflict is simply the ordinary continuation of structural tension in a complex society. Yet ordinary does not mean small. For the people living it, this is the texture of existence. Duty, scarcity, rivalry, ritual, hope, complaint. And complaint, by the way, is one of humanity's oldest renewable resources. You can almost hear it. Somebody in the field muttering about water levels. Somebody in the workshop muttering about quotas. Somebody in the temple muttering about offerings. Somebody in the palace muttering about the temple. Civilization is born, and within moments everyone is already slightly annoyed. That may sound playful, but it points towards something real. The hidden conflict may not need to be imagined as a secret war between invisible factions. It may live in the way Sumerian civilization constantly frames order as a fragile achievement rather than a permanent state. Archaeology suggests urban success in Mesopotamia required continuous maintenance. Canals silt up, levees fail, fields salinize, dynasties fall. If divine beings once represented the architecture of order, then their distance from daily life could make human responsibility feel heavier, not lighter. A fringe idea proposes that such burden reflects a memory of divine abandonment, as though the gods stepped back and left humans to finish a quarrel they began. This theory is not widely accepted, but it survives because it captures a mood the texts sometimes seem to carry, not just reverence, but strain. Not just obedience, but management under pressure. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a useful bedtime lens, not a claim. So you keep walking through the city at first light, past damp courtyards and reed baskets, past tethered donkeys and low walls still cool from the night. The canal glints. Somewhere a scribe presses signs into clay with the stubborn optimism of a person trying to organise chaos before breakfast. And all around you that the great Sumerian balance holds, but only because countless hands keep holding it. Maybe that is the first real inheritance after the gods seem farther away. Not a treasure, not a weapon, but a burden. A system. An old argument dressed as daily work. That burden settles more clearly in your hands now as the city lifts fully into morning. Because sooner or later, every Sumerian question about order leads you toward power. And every question about power leads you toward kingship. Not kingship in the fairy tale sense with velvet curtains and flattering portraits and a suspicious number of harpists, but kingship in the old Mesopotamian sense, a sacred office standing between divine expectation and human disorder, between the temple platform and the canal bank, between famine, pride and paperwork. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian rulers presented their authority as part of a cosmic arrangement rather than a mere political convenience. And of course they did. Nothing improves the mood around taxes quite like implying the universe itself filed the request. One of the most famous lines linked to Mesopotamian royal ideology comes from the Sumerian king list, with its striking formula that kingship descended from heaven. Most historians agree that this text is not a neutral historical record in the modern sense. It is part memory, part ideology, part literary shaping of the past. Archaeology suggests some rulers named in such traditions were real, while the lengths of reigns and the sequence of dynasties often reflect political and symbolic purposes rather than straightforward chronology. The evidence we do have points to a world in which rulership had to be framed as legitimate, sacred, and bigger than any one city's temporary success. One interpretation is that saying kingship came from heaven is less about providing a literal eyewitness report and more about insisting that order has a source beyond human squabbling. And that insistence is revealing, because if kingship must keep being described as heaven's gift, then perhaps people keep needing reassurance that the system is not merely a dressed-up struggle among ambitious men. A careful reading might suggest that the language of sacred kingship masks an anxiety about authority after divine presence feels more distant or less direct. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but the formula itself has a nervous edge to it. It does not say power grew naturally from the soil like barley. It says power came down. It descended. It had to arrive from somewhere else. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if this repeated emphasis is a cultural way of holding the throne steady after the room has already begun to sway? You can picture the setting. The ruler sponsors temple construction, oversees canals, leads, in war receives praise in inscriptions, and presents himself as the chosen maintainer of balance. His image is not simply that of a military strongman. He is organizer, defender, builder, ritual participant, visible custodian of right order. Most historians agree that kingship in Sumer develops within a changing political landscape, with titles like Lugal and Ensi carrying different implications in different places and periods. Historians still argue whether early Sumerian political leadership emerged primarily from temple-based administration, from military command, or from a more complex blend of local traditions that changed from city to city. There is no full consensus because Sumer inconveniently, for modern tidy thinkers, refuses to sit still in one diagram. Still, the broader pattern remains. Authority has to be made meaningful. It has to be narrated. It has to be richly anchored. And that means the king becomes a kind of living explanation for why society should continue to cohere. If the gods are still supreme, the ruler acts below them. If the gods feel less directly present, the ruler's symbolic role grows heavier. One interpretation is that this weight preserves the memory of an older divine order, now filtered through human institutions. In that sense, the king is not just governing a city, he is filling a distance. The distance shows up in the texts in subtle ways. Royal inscriptions often speak of restoring temples, digging canals, repairing walls, defeating enemies, and re-establishing justice or proper arrangement. What's broadly accepted is that these are standard claims of ancient rulership found across Mesopotamian history. A more cautious explanation could be that such rhetoric tells us more about royal ideals than about daily reality, but that too is revealing. If rulers constantly say they are restoring order, then order is either frequently broken or frequently imagined as threatened, possibly both. Ancient kings, like modern people updating productivity apps at midnight, tend to advertise stability most when stability feels least secure. And so the hidden conflict may continue not in the form of a secret plot, but in the structure of legitimacy itself. The king sits on the throne, but the throne is standing on an argument. Who assigned this role? Which god backs this city? Why does one dynasty rise and another fall? Why does sacred favour appear to move? Archaeology suggests that Sumerian political life involved repeated shifts in influence among cities and ruling houses. The evidence we do have points to no single uninterrupted order, but but to a landscape of competition and reorganisation. That instability may help explain why kingship is described in such elevated terms. The higher the claim, the more urgently it may be needed. A popular rumour claims that the phrase about kingship descending from heaven preserves a literal memory of non-human rulers handing government to humanity before departing. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. The mainstream reading sees the phrase as part of Mesopotamian royal theology and political ideology, not as a coded transfer document from otherworldly administrators. But if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still tells us something about why these texts fascinate people. They seem to hover at the boundary between myth and institution, between story and system, between divine names and very human stress. That boundary is where your attention belongs tonight. Imagine entering a temple court where officials move with polished seriousness, offerings are arranged, and the ruler's authority feels scripted into the architecture itself. The bricks, the platforms, the processions, the carved dedications. Everything says this order is real. Everything says it belongs. Everything says the world has a centre. And yet just beneath that confidence there may be a softer murmur. If kingship truly descends from heaven, what happens when heaven feels far away? When the old gods remain, named, invoked and honoured, but the burden of keeping fields watered and borders secure falls more obviously on human shoulders. That is where the story grows interesting without becoming reckless. We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. And one clue is that sacred kingship may represent not just confidence, but compensation. A visible answer to an invisible problem. A ritual bridge across a widening gap. The king in this reading becomes the manager of inherited tension, the official face of continued order, after some older immediacy has receded into story. So the throne gleams, the titles, rise the inscriptions, praise and the city listens. But the throne does not erase conflict. It organises it. It names it. It sanctifies it. And somewhere behind every royal boast, you can almost hear the same old question rustling like reeds at the canal edge. Who is holding the world together now, and for how long? And once the throne has been set in place with all its sacred polish and carefully arranged gravity, you start to notice what actually keeps that shining order alive from day to day. Not royal speeches, not mysterious lights over the marshes, not dramatic background music from nowhere sadly. What keeps the city breathing is work. Repetitive, measurable, exhausting work. Grain must be grown, moved, stored, counted, distributed and offered. Wool must be collected and woven. Fields must be irrigated. Labourers must be assigned. Rations must be recorded. Temple courtyards must stay supplied. The whole elegant structure of Sumerian civilization, for all its myths and hymns, rests heavily on very practical human shoulders. Archaeology suggests that temple institutions played a major role in the economy of early Mesopotamian cities, overseeing land labour, storage and ritual offerings. What's broadly accepted is that temple households were not merely places of prayer in a modern sense. They were administrative centres, landholders, employers, and symbolic anchors of the city. If you are standing in one of these precincts with mud brick walls rising around granaries and workshops, what you are really seeing is a machine for turning labour into order. A sacred machine, yes, but a machine all the same. Even the holiest civilizations still need somebody to carry sacks before breakfast. The evidence we do have points to a world where grain was not just food. It was payment planning, status security and survival. Barley rations appear in administrative texts because barley is the pulse of the system. One interpretation is that behind all this careful counting lies a deep anxiety about whether the system can keep carrying the weight placed on it. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But when a culture writes so much about allocation, duty and provision, it is fair to notice the strain in its administrative heartbeat. A careful reading might suggest that the hidden conflict after the Anunnaki is not necessarily a war in the dramatic sense, but a continuation of burden, a tension over who now bears the load once framed as divine order. This becomes especially interesting when you remember the Mesopotamian tradition preserved most clearly in Akkadian texts like Atrahasis, in which humans are created to take over labour from lesser gods. That tradition is not originally a Sumerian administrative memo, and it belongs to a broader Mesopotamian mythic development. But the theme matters. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian myths often connect humanity with service maintenance and duty toward the divine order. One interpretation is that such stories reflect a society where labour itself felt cosmically assigned. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth simply magnifies the obvious truth of life. In early cities, somebody always has to do the work, and the work never quite ends. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if later memories of divine departure resonate because the burden remains, even after the presence feels remote? If the gods are less immediate and the system still demands endless maintenance, then human beings may experience themselves as inheritors of an unfinished arrangement. Not abandoned exactly, not free either, just responsible, which is somehow even ruder. You can almost hear the temple day beginning around you. Reed baskets scraping across hard-packed earth, footsteps in courtyards, clerks murmuring numbers, the soft tap of stylus into clay, smoke rising from ovens, a donkey objecting on philosophical grounds to its workload, workers receiving grain rations, supervisors checking deliveries, priests preparing offerings. The sacred and the administrative are intertwined so tightly that separating them feels artificial. What's broadly accepted is that in Sumerian urban life, religion was not a private compartment tucked away from economics and politics. It structured the whole city's understanding of order and obligation. Historians still argue whether temple institutions in the earliest phases dominated economic life to a greater degree than later palace-centred models, or whether that contrast has been exaggerated by modern scholarship. The debate continues because evidence varies by period and city, and because ancient institutions overlap in messy ways. But whatever the exact balance, the larger point remains. Human labour is organised on a grand scale, and that organisation must be justified not only practically, but symbolically. To carry grain into a temple storehouse is to feed a system that links your hands to heaven. That is where the hidden conflict starts to feel intimate rather than abstract. A popular rumour claims the old texts preserve traces of resentment, as though humanity was saddled with tasks once meant for divine beings and never quite got over it. This theory is not widely accepted as a historical conclusion, but as a reading of mood, it is not entirely absurd. Ancient Near Eastern texts do sometimes carry a tone of burden, duty and unease around work, order and divine expectations. If we treat that as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it suggests something powerful. The conflict continuing after divine departure may be remembered less as open rebellion and more as pressure inside the system itself. The tension between labour demanded and labour endured, between sacred explanation and tired bodies. And tired bodies are never just background details. They are the city. Imagine the warehouse, after midday heat, has begun to settle like a blanket you did not ask for. The grain smell is thick, dust clings to skin. A worker shifts another load and wonders in words no tablet records whether the universe could perhaps try lifting for once. There is one of your 3 light jokes for the evening. But the point underneath it is serious. Civilization is maintained by countless unglamorous acts, and Sumer knew that. Its tablets count the pieces. Its myths give them meaning. Its rulers praise the order produced by them. Yet none of that removes the burden from the people doing the carrying. A fringe idea proposes that this entire system preserves the memory of a transfer of responsibility from divine beings to humanity after some ancient rupture among the gods. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is far too thin to present as fact. Still, if we keep the solid ground separate from the myths, the fringe version exaggerates a real feature of the texts. Human society often appears as the manager of sacred order under pressure. The gods remain above named and honoured, but the daily strain sits below in storehouses, fields, workshops and canal ditches. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is the temple economy, the labour system, the tablets full of rations and accounts. What's interpretation is the idea that these may preserve emotional echoes of a larger post-divine conflict. What's imagined very softly is the thought that every counted basket of barley might be part of a much older argument no one can fully remember. So you leave the storehouse with dust on your sandals and the smell of grain still lingering in your clothes. Behind you, the scribes keep pressing wedges into clay, pinning order down for one more day, and the city, for all its sacred geometry, keeps running on the same uneasy fuel obligation memory and the quiet human effort of carrying what no god seems to carry directly anymore. The grain dust fades from your clothes, but the feeling of inherited burden stays with you as you move deeper into the sacred imagination of Mesopotamia, where names matter, roles matter, and divine personalities are never just decorative. Among the most important figures drifting through this world are Enki and Enlil, two great gods whose differing associations have fascinated readers for generations. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was not a simple fixed system, with perfectly uniform meanings across every city and century. Archaeology suggests that beliefs and emphasis shifted over time, and what's broadly accepted is that gods could hold overlapping roles while remaining tied to different centres' traditions and theological moods. Still, one interpretation is that the contrast between Enki and Enlil came to symbolise something larger than divine biography. It may have echoed competing ideas about order itself. Enlil, often associated with air authority and kingly power, occupies a commanding place in Sumerian and later Mesopotamian tradition. His cult centre at Nippur gave him enormous prestige, and his will often appears linked with rulership, destiny, and the structuring of the world. Enki, centred at Eridu, is connected with wisdom, fresh water craft, intelligence, and boundary-crossing cleverness. If Enlil sometimes feels like the stern architecture of command, Enki often feels like the sideways intelligence that knows where the cracks are and how to work through them. That is a simplified sketch, yes, but even simplified sketches can be revealing. One god carries the gravity of decree. The other brings adaptability, cunning, and deep knowledge. Put them together and you get a tension familiar to every civilization that has ever argued over whether rules matter more than ingenuity. And let's be honest, that argument still walks among us. Somewhere right now, a manager is explaining the policy while a technician quietly fixes the actual problem. A careful reading might suggest that these two divine profiles preserve more than just theological diversity. They may express different visions of how order works. Does order depend on hierarchy and boundaries and command from above, or does it depend on wisdom, flexibility, and the ability to respond creatively when life refuses to follow the chart? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths should not be reduced into modern personality tests with sandals, but the contrast remains meaningful. The evidence we do have points to a religious world capable of holding internal tension without dissolving into chaos. In fact, that tension may be the point. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the hidden conflict after the Anunnaki is remembered not as open warfare, but as an unresolved split in the logic of rule itself? One interpretation is that later Readers sensed in these traditions a lingering contest between modes of governance, decree, and adaptation, distance and intimacy, command and care. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But once you see how often Mesopotamian texts return to the questions of who decides who, interprets who restores, and who bears the consequences, the old divine contrasts begin to feel less ornamental. Archaeology suggests that Nippur and Eridu held different kinds of significance within Mesopotamian sacred geography, and what's broadly accepted is that local cults and city loyalties shaped how divine roles were imagined. Religion in Sumer was not one monolithic voice speaking in tidy bullet points. It was a living tradition rooted in places, institutions, and political realities. A god's prestige could rise alongside a city's influence. A theological emphasis could reflect local identity as much as universal truth. Historians still argue whether certain divine tensions in the texts reflect deep doctrinal differences shifting political priorities, or simply the normal diversity of a long-lived religious culture. That debate matters because it keeps us careful. We do not need to turn every divine contrast into a hidden code. A more cautious explanation could be that Enki and Enlil represent the natural complexity of a civilization, trying to think through authority, survival, and justice in mythic terms. Yet even under that cautious reading, the emotional effect remains. The gods do not all pull in exactly the same symbolic direction. They create a world in which order is meaningful but never effortless. Enki especially invites attention because he often appears in stories as the figure of insight, mediation, or clever intervention. In later Mesopotamian traditions, he can seem like the god who understands the human condition too well to leave it entirely to formal decree. This is not the same as calling him a rebel hero in the modern sense. Let me rephrase that more carefully. He is not simply the good cop in an ancient cosmic drama, but one interpretation is that his profile allowed later storytellers and readers to imagine a more intimate divine intelligence working within the rigid structure of fate and command. If Enlil represents the imposing weight of order, Enki sometimes feels like the possibility that order can be negotiated without shattering. And that possibility matters in a world where burdens have already fallen heavily on human communities. A fringe idea proposes that the tensions between gods like Enki and Enlil preserve the memory of actual factions among higher beings whose disagreements spilled into human history. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is much too thin to carry such a claim responsibly. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the fringe version exaggerates a real textual feeling divine order. In Mesopotamian tradition can appear internally complex, even strained. The pantheon does not always read like a perfectly synchronized choir. Sometimes it feels more like a council where everyone technically agrees on the mission, but not on the method, which, to be fair, is the most realistic thing about any institution ever. You can sense this in the imaginative texture of the world. Water from the deep cool and life-giving belongs to Enki's sphere. Authority from the high places, binding and weighty, belongs to Enlil's. Below them stand kings, priests, labourers, scribes and families, all trying to live inside the arrangement. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion gave people a framework for understanding the forces shaping their lives. One interpretation is that it also gave them a language for tension they could not otherwise name. The hidden conflict in that sense may continue in every human effort to reconcile command with compassion, structure, with survival law, with the messiness of actual existence. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. We cannot confirm some secret divine civil war lingering in the archives like an unfinished office email from the Bronze Age, But we can see that Sumerian and Mesopotamian traditions preserve divine distinctions that feel morally and politically charged. We can see that later readers noticed. We can see why they wondered. So as evening light slips across the temple bricks and the canal holds the sky in broken reflection, you begin to understand that the hidden conflict may not have needed armies to survive. It may have endured in preferences, loyalties, rituals and stories, in which God seemed closer, in which kind of rule felt bearable, in whether the world was held together by decree alone or by wisdom, that bent quietly around human fragility. And that old question pressed into clay and remembered in prayer does not fade when the gods feel farther away. It settles into the people who remain. That question settles into the people who remain, and nowhere does it settle more uneasily than in the memory of flood. Water has always been both blessing and threat in Mesopotamia. It feeds the fields, fills the canals, cools the air at dusk, and then when it chooses violence over generosity, it reminds every proud city that mud brick is only sun-dried confidence. Archaeology suggests that the river systems of southern Mesopotamia brought both fertility and destruction, and what's broadly accepted is that flood experience shaped the imagination of the region deeply. This is mainstream ground. Real communities lived with water's moods. Real settlements rose, shifted, and sometimes disappeared. Real people watched the horizon and tried to guess whether the next season would nourish them or mock them. From that world comes one of the most enduring themes in ancient Near Eastern literature, the Great Flood. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood traditions, preserved in texts like the Sumerian flood story and later in Akkadian, works such as Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, do not give us a journalistic report of one globally measured event. A more cautious explanation could be that these traditions grow from generations of devastating local or regional floods layered into mythic memory over time. The evidence we do have points to long cultural remembrance of disaster, not to a simple one-to-one match between one tablet and one weather forecast. Ancient scribes sadly did not include a rainfall radar app, and yet flood stories in Mesopotamia feel emotionally larger than natural disaster alone. One interpretation is that they preserve not only fear of water, but anxiety about a fracture in trust between heaven and earth. If the gods can order destruction, if human noise or behaviour can provoke divine action, if survival depends on a chosen few receiving warning, then the flood becomes more than weather. It becomes a story about insecurity at the centre of existence. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the flood marks a memory of relationship gone wrong, of a world in which divine order no longer feels steadily protective but sharply conditional? That is a possibility, not a certainty. Still, the emotional architecture of these stories matters. In Atrahasis, the issue famously involves human noise disturbing the gods. In Gilgamesh, the flood is retold as an inherited catastrophe remembered by Utnapishtim. In the Sumerian king traditions, flood can serve as a dividing line between ages. What's broadly accepted is that these stories become organising memories, separating before and after old order and new arrangement. A careful reading might suggest that flood tradition also preserves the sense that whatever relationship once linked divine beings and humanity had become unstable, perhaps even adversarial, or at least painfully unpredictable. You can feel that instability in the very landscape. A canal overflows. A field vanishes under brown water. Reed huts collapse. Storehouses are threatened. Boats break loose. The neat human geometry of irrigation turns into a broad, indifferent sheet of force. Archaeology suggests that river instability was a long-term fact of life in Mesopotamia, and the evidence we do have points to repeated environmental pressures shaping settlement and state formation. But myth takes that physical reality and asks a deeper question. What kind of world allows this to happen? Not just physically, but morally. Historians still argue whether flood narratives in Mesopotamia should be read chiefly as theological reflection, literary tradition, social memory of disaster or political myth used to frame legitimacy after upheaval. There is no full consensus because ancient stories rarely stay in one category. They are too clever for that. They move between ritual instruction, warning, and wonder. One interpretation is that the flood becomes a symbolic reset, a terrifying interruption, after which humans must rebuild under altered conditions. If so, then the hidden conflict after the Anunnaki may not be about their literal departure at all, but about what remains after divine trust has been damaged. The burden is still here, the system survives, but the certainty is gone. A popular rumour claims that the flood marks the moment ancient higher beings tried to erase a failed human experiment and then withdrew, leaving survivors to manage the aftermath. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. The mainstream view places these stories within the long and complex tradition of Mesopotamian myth-making, shaped by environmental experience and theological imagination. But if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reflects a real feature of the texts after Catastrophe. The relationship between divine power and human life feels altered, more distant, more negotiated, more haunted by caution. That caution lingers. You see it in how survivors in flood stories become bearers of memory. They do not simply live. They remember what the world can become when order fails. They carry knowledge forward, not unlike a scribe carrying a damp tablet under his arm while trying very hard not to trip in the mud and accidentally erase civilization. There is your next light joke, and honestly, it feels deserved. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian literature often uses catastrophe to clarify human limitations. The gods are powerful, humans are vulnerable. Yet one interpretation is that flood memory also gives humans a strange new role. They become custodians of aftermath, builders after ruin, reciters of warning. If divine order once seemed immediate, flood stories suggest a world in which humanity must continue under the shadow of what heaven may allow. That does not mean the gods are absent. It means trust is not simple. And trust may be the hidden thread running through everything tonight, because a civilization can survive disaster and still feel changed by it. The levees are rebuilt, the temples stand again, offerings return, kings claim restored order, fields are rezoned. But memory does not drain away as fast as flood water. It leaves a residue. A careful reading might suggest that this residue is part of the hidden conflict itself, continuing long after the immediate event. Not spears clashing in the dark, but unease passed from story to story, a sense that the world is arranged, yes, but not guaranteed, sacred but not safe, structured but only with effort. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is clear enough. Mesopotamians lived with flood risk and preserved major flood traditions in their literature. The interpretation is that those traditions may encode a deeper anxiety about divine-human relations after rupture. The imagined part, kept soft and quiet, is the thought that every evening Canal Shimmer in Sumer carries a memory older than the city walls, a memory of waters that once rearranged not only the land, but the emotional contract between gods and people. So the river settles, the reeds whisper again, and the city resumes its careful breathing. But now, beneath the routine, another layer remains. Not only the burden of labour, not only the problem of rule, also the memory that trust can drown and leave behind a civilization very good at rebuilding and never entirely certain why it must. And because memory never sits still in Mesopotamia, because stories travel almost as stubbornly as water, the flood does not remain where it began. It moves. It is copied, reshaped, translated, polished, repurposed, and carried into later worlds by later scribes, who inherit both the old words and the old unease. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature did not stay frozen inside one language, one dynasty or one city. Sumerian compositions were preserved, adapted and reworked by Akkadian-speaking cultures, and later Babylonian and Assyrian traditions continued to engage with them in creative ways. Archaeology suggests that scribal schools played a crucial role in this process, training generations to copy, memorize and transmit texts that were already ancient by the time they handled them. So when you imagine a hidden conflict continuing after the Anunnaki seem farther away, you do not need to imagine one lost tablet hidden behind a suspicious wall panel while dramatic music swells. You can imagine something more ordinary and in its own way more interesting. You can imagine repetition, a young apprentice copying an older composition line by line, a master scribe correcting errors with that ancient universal expression of disappointment known to every student in every century, a myth entering a new political moment and being nudged just enough to fit, a city inheriting a story that still carries the mood of another city's fears. One interpretation is that this scribal transmission allows unresolved themes to survive long after their original setting changes. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But the mechanism is real. The evidence we do have points to a long tradition of textual continuity in Mesopotamia, where older Sumerian literature remained prestigious, even when Sumerian was no longer a spoken vernacular. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the hidden conflict continues, not through direct memory of an event, but through the survival of narrative structures that keep teaching people the world is fragile, authority is contested, and order always costs more than it appears to? The copy itself becomes part of the mystery. Most historians agree that ancient scribes were not passive photocopiers with sandals. They selected, arranged, glossed, and in some cases reshaped what they transmitted. A more cautious explanation could be that variation in these traditions reflects normal literary evolution rather than deliberate preservation of hidden meanings. Still, literary evolution is precisely how cultural tension survives. You do not need a conspiracy when you have schools' prestige texts and centuries of respectful editing. That is how civilizations whisper to themselves across time. Consider the flood traditions again, or the stories of kingship or divine roles attached to Enki and Enlil. Their exact form shift, but the emotional architecture remains recognizable. Human beings live under sacred order. Sacred order is powerful, necessary, and occasionally unsettling. Divine intentions are not always transparent. Human labour continues beneath them. Cities rise and fall, but the question of who truly holds the world together never quite leaves the room. A careful reading might suggest that later retellings keep this old tension alive, even when the original social setting has changed. The hidden conflict, then, is not static. It migrates. Archaeology suggests that scribal education in Mesopotamia involved copying lexical lists, hymns, myths, proverbs, and model texts, creating both continuity and standardization. What's broadly accepted is that such schools preserved not only language, but cultural worldview. Historians still argue whether scribal transmission primarily stabilized tradition or constantly transformed it in subtle ways. The honest answer is probably both. To preserve a text is already to reinterpret it. To teach a story is already to frame it. To write an old line in a new age is to ask it a new question, whether you mean to or not. And new ages do ask new questions. When later Babylonian scholars handle older Sumerian material, they do so within different political landscapes, different theological emphases, different imperial horizons. Yet the old material is still useful, still resonant, still capable of organising thought. That alone tells you something. If a tradition survives this long, it is because it continues to answer needs, or at least continues to dignify questions. One interpretation is that the old stories retained power precisely because they never fully resolved their tensions. A finished answer rarely needs this much copying. A puzzle does. A fringe idea proposes that scribes themselves may have knowingly encoded traces of an older secret struggle beneath the respectable surface of temple and court literature. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. There is no responsible basis for imagining a tidy underground network of Bronze Age truth leakers slipping cosmic spoilers into homework tablets. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the fringe version enlarges something genuine ancient texts often preserve more than one layer of meaning, and later readers often sense that. Not because the scribes were necessarily hiding laser beam revelations in cuneiform margins, but because tradition itself is layered. That layering is where the air begins to feel charged. You are in a tablet house now, where clay sits stacked in baskets and shelves, where language itself seems to have weight. A line copied today may have been old when your teacher's teacher was young. The same signs can carry prayer policy memory and debate. The room smells faintly of dust reed and human concentration, which is not the most glamorous perfume in history, but it has its own dignity. Outside the city changes, dynasties shift, armies march, trade routes move, inside the text keeps breathing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm that later scribes consciously preserved a secret post-Anunnaki conflict as a coded historical account. That goes far beyond the evidence. But we can see that old themes persisted. We can see that divine human tension, fragile order, and inherited burden remained compelling across centuries. We can see why later readers, ancient and modern alike, felt that something unresolved was still moving underneath the surface. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is textual continuity. Sumerian traditions were copied and adapted far beyond their original moment. The interpretation is that such continuity may have carried unresolved tensions forward into new eras. The imagined part, kept quiet and careful, is the thought that every copied wedge mark is like a footprint in wet clay, preserving not just information but pressure. So the tablet passes from hand to hand, century to century, city to city. The gods change, emphasis, the kings change names, the languages shift, but the deeper mood endures. Order remains precious. Authority remains contested. The old questions remain useful, and somewhere in that long chain of copying, the hidden conflict stops being an event and becomes a tradition of unease still alive, because nobody ever copied it enough to make it disappear. That tradition of unease does not live only in royal inscriptions or in careful rows of school tablets. It settles into kitchens, fields, alleys, workshops, and reed boats. It settles into the bodies of ordinary people who do not get remembered by name nearly as often as kings and gods, which is rude but very historically normal. If you want to understand how a hidden conflict could continue long after divine figures seem to retreat into story, you have to leave the formal language of temples for a while and look at the people underneath it all. Most historians agree that the overwhelming majority of ancient Mesopotamians were farmers, labourers, craftspeople, herders, traders, servants and dependents whose lives were shaped by institutions much larger than themselves. Archaeology suggests a dense urban and rural world tied together by irrigation, storage exchange and obligation. The evidence we do have points to a civilization in which daily survival was rarely private. It was social, structured and supervised, and that means the conflict, whatever form it took, would have been lived before it was written. You rise before the worst of the heat. You walk through dust that remembers yesterday's footsteps. Water jars are heavy, tools are simple, food is plain. Work begins early because the sun, unlike modern office culture, does not bother pretending it might be flexible. Barley must be planted, weeded, cut, dried, carried, counted. Sheep must be managed. Wool must be processed. Clay must be shaped. Fish must be caught. Roofs must be repaired. Children must be fed. Offerings must still be made. What's broadly accepted is that life in ancient Mesopotamia demanded coordination and endurance from people at every level of society. Even the quietest households sat inside a larger network of expectation. One interpretation is that myths and sacred stories gave emotional shape to these pressures. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But it makes sense. A civilization does not tell stories only to entertain itself. It tells stories to place suffering, duty and unpredictability inside a meaningful frame. A careful reading might suggest that the hidden conflict after the Anunnaki survives in the human feeling of being caught between demands from above and needs below. Above you stand the gods, the rulers, the temple officials, the inherited order. Below you waits the field, the child, the ration bowl, the broken wall, the fatigue in your legs. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if cosmic conflict becomes compelling precisely because ordinary life already feels like mediation between forces you do not control? The strange beauty of Sumerian civilization is that it never fully separates practical life from sacred order. Most historians agree that religion in Mesopotamia did not occupy a sealed spiritual corner. It helped structure calendars, labour authority, and public identity. The temple is not just where you pray, it is where grain moves, where status is displayed, where festivals punctuate time, where legitimacy becomes visible. So when ordinary people participate in ritual, they are not escaping the system. They are entering it more fully. One interpretation is that this can feel reassuring. Another is that it can feel heavy. Often, of course, it is both, which is the standard human arrangement. Archaeology suggests that households in ancient Mesopotamia varied widely in wealth and security, and texts reveal debt, hierarchy, labour assignments, and legal disputes as persistent realities. What's broadly accepted is that ordinary people lived within systems of dependence that could provide structure while also producing strain. Historians still argue whether temple and palace institutions should be seen primarily as protective coordinators of a difficult environment, or as extractive powers that intensified social inequality. The truth may differ by time and place, but the debate itself matters. It reminds you that order can feel very different depending on whether you are announcing it from a platform or carrying it on your back. And backs, after all, are where civilizations keep their honest records. You can imagine a woman grinding grain in a courtyard, while children doze in the shade, a potter lifting wet clay from a basin, a fisherman checking reed traps at dawn, a labour gang clearing silt from a canal under a supervisor's eye, a brewer stirring mash while flies insist on contributing opinions. None of these people needs a cosmic theory to know that life is precarious. The canal must hold, the ration must arrive, the tax must not crush, the god must not be offended, the king must not recruit your sons at the wrong moment, the storm must pass, the harvest must come. A popular rumour claims ancient people lived in a state of constant mystical awareness, reading divine messages in every ripple and cough. This theory is not widely accepted in that exaggerated form. People also joked, argued, flirted, complained and worried about dinner. Ancient life was sacred, yes, but it was also stubbornly practical. That practical texture matters because it makes the hidden conflict more believable when read as lived tension rather than secret spectacle. The evidence we do have points to human communities constantly balancing obedience, necessity, hope, and resentment. One interpretation is that myths of divine tension resonated because they reflected the emotional truth of ordinary survival. If the gods themselves disagree, then your own divided feelings about duty make more sense. If the old order feels distant, then your exhaustion is not merely personal. It belongs to the structure of the world. A fringe idea proposes that ordinary people in Mesopotamia carried an unspoken folk memory of abandoned divine rule, passing it through custom rather than formal doctrine. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it captures something emotionally plausible. People often preserve tensions in proverb, gesture, ritual, habit, and shared mood long after official explanations have hardened. A civilization can forget an event and remember its pressure, and pressure leaves marks. On clay, yes, but also on posture, routine, and expectation. A child learns when to stay quiet near officials. A worker learns how much grain should weigh in the hand. A family learns whether this season feels safer than the last. A city learns which rumour to fear. You do not need a written confession of cosmic conflict to recognise a society skilled at managing uncertainty. The hidden conflict may continue because everyone has become used to living inside its weather. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the structure of ordinary Mesopotamian life under organised institutions. The interpretation is that sacred narratives may have mirrored the emotional strain of that life. The imagined part held softly is the thought that when a labourer wiped sweat from his face at noon and glanced toward a temple tower, he may have felt not only reverence, but the old human question, who asked us to carry all this? The city never answers aloud. It just keeps moving. Children run past courtyards. Donkeys complain. Pots crack in kilns. Reeds bend in the breeze. Barley is measured. Names are recorded. And among all these ordinary motions, the great inherited tension remains not grand enough to interrupt the day, not small enough to disappear. It lives where most real history lives, in the space between survival and meaning. The space between survival and meaning is exactly where anxiety likes to make a home, and Mesopotamia, for all its brilliance, knew anxiety on an almost professional level. This is not because ancient people were uniquely gloomy. It is because they lived in a world where signs mattered. Signs in weather, in births, in dreams, in unusual animal behaviour, in eclipses, in strange patterns that might slip past a relaxed mind, but not past a civilization trained to suspect that order could wobble without warning. Most historians agree that divination played a major role in Mesopotamian life, especially in later periods where omen literature becomes impressively detailed. The evidence we do have points to a sustained belief that the world could be read if one knew how to look. And people looked. They looked at the sky, they looked at livers, they looked at oil on water, they listened to dreams, they tracked eclipses, deformities at birth, odd animal behaviour, unusual weather. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian scholarly traditions developed extensive systems of omen interpretation, particularly in Babylonian and Assyrian contexts, though they grew out of older habits of divine inquiry. What's broadly accepted is that divination was not fringe nonsense on the margins of serious life. It was serious life. Kings consulted experts, priests interpreted signs, scholars compiled lists, whole intellectual traditions grew around the possibility that heaven and earth were in active communication. If you were hoping for a quiet civilization that shrugged and said, probably nothing, this is not that civilization. One interpretation is that this constant search for signs reflects a deeper cultural fear that old conflicts still echo through daily events. That is a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that divination simply offered practical and psychological tools for managing uncertainty in a dangerous world. But even that cautious reading tells you something important. Why would a culture devote such effort to reading signs unless it felt that reality itself was full of pressure, ambiguity, and unstable intention? A careful reading might suggest that the hidden conflict after the Anunnaki survives not as an open narrative, but as a habit of vigilance. If the world is full of signals, then something unresolved may still be moving through it. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if omen culture does not prove divine conflict, but preserves the emotional afterlife of a world in which divine will feels both necessary and difficult to trust? The canal may shimmer peacefully, but an eclipse can still darken noon. A lamb may be born oddly. A ruler may dream badly. A liver may show some feature the experts find disturbing. And suddenly the entire political atmosphere tightens because sacred order is no longer assumed. It must be checked, interpreted, reassured. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divination should be understood primarily as religion, early science, political technology, or a hybrid system that resists modern categories. That debate matters because omen practice sits right at the boundary between practical statecraft and metaphysical dread. A king who reads omens is not merely indulging superstition. He is governing inside a worldview where the cosmos and the court are entangled. Most historians agree that this system could be methodical, even scholarly in its own terms. It relied on observation, comparison, precedent, and interpretation. You could call it anxious pattern analysis with excellent branding. The emotional effect of this cannot be overstated. Imagine waking from a vivid dream and knowing it might be discussed in relation to the state. Imagine an eclipse sending whispers through a city already uneasy about harvests or enemies. Imagine officials waiting while specialists inspect a sacrificial liver as though tomorrow's policy memo has been hidden in an organ. There is your light joke, but only barely because to them this was not absurd. It was a way of asking whether the arrangement of the world still held. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian omen texts often collected possible signs with corresponding interpretations rather than offering one simple worldview. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that treated ambiguity as manageable if properly classified. One interpretation is that this classification habit is itself a response to inherited tension. If divine human relations feel complicated, then one way to cope is to turn uncertainty into categories, to index dread, to archive possibility, to make the strange legible before it becomes dangerous. A popular rumour claims omen traditions were really a hidden survival manual left behind after the gods withdrew teaching humans how to detect traces of ongoing unseen struggle. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. There is no responsible basis for turning Mesopotamian divination into a coded post-divine alarm system. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour is touching something genuine omen culture assumes, that visible events may carry invisible significance. That assumption does not require secret wars. It requires only a world in which meaning is layered and order feels conditional. And conditional order is exactly the mood we have been following. You're in a courtyard at dusk now. Oil lamps flicker. The day's heat is draining from the bricks. Somewhere nearby, a dream interpreter or diviner is being consulted in low voices. The city does not sleep inside certainty, it sleeps inside procedure. Signs will be watched, rituals will be performed, corrections will be made if needed, offerings may increase, decisions may be delayed or redirected. A civilization built on canals, labour, and sacred hierarchy now also builds itself on continual interpretive alertness. One interpretation is that this vigilance reflects the enduring memory of a world where trust was fractured long ago, whether by disaster, divine distance, political instability, or some braided combination of all three. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is clear omen, reading divination, and dream interpretation were central features of Mesopotamian thought. The interpretation is that such habits may reflect an inherited anxiety about maintaining right order under uncertain divine conditions. The imagined part offered softly is the thought that every time a scribe recorded an omen, he was not only cataloguing the strange, but listening for echoes of an argument nobody could entirely name anymore. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. We cannot confirm that Mesopotamians read signs because they believed a hidden post-Anunnaki conflict still unfolded behind the veil. But we can see that they lived as though reality required constant checking. We can see that the world felt full of messages. We can see how a civilization shaped by fragile order, flood memory, labour burden, and contested authority might grow exquisitely sensitive to signals. So the stars appear over the plain, the canal darkens into black glass, and the city leans into its rituals of interpretation. The gods may seem high and distant, but the signs keep arriving. And whether those signs reveal fate, fear, or merely the human need to read uncertainty, before it reads you first, they keep the old tension alive in every watchful glance toward the sky. That watchful glance toward the sky eventually drops back down to the earth, because no matter how many omens are read and rituals performed, ancient life still returns to the same practical question. Who controls the water, the fields, the roads, the boundaries, the places where survival becomes ownership, and ownership becomes a sacred claim? In Mesopotamia, borders are never just lines. They are arguments with dirt attached. They are canals with legal consequences. They are fields whose barley can feed a city or embarrass a ruler. Most historians agree that disputes over land and irrigation were central to the political life of Sumerian city-states. Archaeology suggests that the alluvial plain required continuous management, and the evidence we do have points to a world where control over water was inseparable from power. You can stand on a canal bank at sunset and understand this without reading a single inscription. Water glides past calm for the moment, catching copper light. Reeds bend. The fields beyond seem generous, patient, almost innocent. But this landscape is a machine held together by agreements, labour, and force. One diverted channel upstream can ruin a downstream harvest. One disputed boundary marker can turn neighbours into petitioners, petitioners into enemies, and enemies into men standing in dust with spears while everybody claims the gods agree with them. There is no better ancient reminder that sacred language and resource management often sleep in the same bed. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian rulers frequently presented territorial control and irrigation works as duties sanctioned by divine order. Inscriptions celebrate canal digging, field restoration, boundary enforcement, and the protection of productive land. This is mainstream ground. The land must be organised, the water must be guided, the ruler must be seen doing both. One interpretation is that sacred language does not merely decorate these practical concerns, it transforms them into part of a larger cosmic arrangement. A careful reading might suggest that when territory is described as divinely ordered, any dispute over it begins to look like more than local competition. It becomes part of a deeper inherited division. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the hidden conflict after the Anunnaki survives in the way human beings sacralize scarcity? If divine figures once assigned roles, domains, and powers in myth, then later humans may repeat that same logic on the ground. This field belongs under this patronage, this canal under this city, this boundary under this king, this prosperity under this god. And when those claims collide, the conflict can feel older than the men fighting it, not because a cosmic map is visibly floating over the plain, but because political struggle has absorbed sacred memory into its language. The evidence we do have points vividly to this fusion. The famous disputes between city-states such as Lagash and Umur were not only about practical access, they were narrated in terms of rightful order, legitimate boundaries and divine sanction. Most historians agree that rulers used inscriptions to justify territorial claims by invoking God's ancestors' treaties and prior arrangements. Historians still argue whether such inscriptions reflect sincere religious conviction, calculated political messaging, or some inseparable combination of both. The answer is almost certainly the combination. Ancient kings did not separate practical policy from sacred meaning because their whole world was built from both at once. This matters because it allows the hidden conflict to continue in plain sight without ever needing to name itself directly. A more cautious explanation could be that later readers project mystery onto what are essentially ordinary territorial disputes. And yes, ordinary disputes explain a great deal, but ordinary in a civilization like Sumer is already charged with cosmological importance. A field is never just a field when its harvest supports a temple. A canal is never just a canal when it determines which city can present itself as favoured, stable, and properly aligned with heaven. One interpretation is that resource conflict became one of the main earthly theatres where inherited sacred tension played itself out. You can imagine the scene. Surveyors and officials examine markers. Farmers mutter darkly about water levels. Messengers move between courts. Priests bless actions that are underneath the incense, still about access and authority. The earth is measured but also narrated, measured but also mythologized. There is something wonderfully human about this. Put two groups near a water source, give them a cosmic vocabulary, and by sunset, somebody will be defending irrigation policy as destiny. A popular rumour claims that ancient boundary conflicts preserve literal memories of territories once assigned by the Anunnaki themselves, with later human rulers merely inheriting those divine jurisdictions. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. Mainstream scholarship sees these disputes as products of urban growth, resource pressure, political competition, and religious ideology within historical Mesopotamia, but if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still mirrors a real feature of the text the land is described as meaningful beyond economics. It is part of order, part of legitimacy, part of the emotional geography of power. And emotional geography is not a small thing. People remember where water failed, where walls stood, where a father worked, where an offering was made, where a treaty was broken. Memory clings to place. Archaeology suggests that canals, levees, and field systems were constantly modified over time, creating a landscape that was engineered but never finished. The hidden conflict may endure there as well, not in buried machines or dramatic secret chambers, but in the endless human struggle to maintain a world that looks natural only because so much effort has gone into making it appear that way. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the fierce significance of irrigation boundaries and territorial dispute in Sumerian political life. The interpretation is that sacred language around these disputes may preserve deeper anxieties about inherited order and divided legitimacy. The imagined part, kept carefully in the mist, is the thought that each boundary stone stands like a tiny fossil of a much older quarrel, one no longer remembered clearly, but still reenacted every time water is measured and land is claimed. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm that every canal dispute is the late echo of a divine partition. But we can see why such an idea seduces the imagination. The land itself is organised as if meaning has been assigned to it. The arguments are too intense to feel merely technical. The rituals around power are too elaborate to feel merely economic. The cities fight, build, bless and measure as if the plain is both field and scripture. So the canal keeps flowing between banks lined by human intention. Reeds rustle. Mud holds footprints. Survey lines fade and are redrawn. And beneath the visible work of boundaries and embankments, the old tension remains, now dressed as policy, now speaking in the language of land, now proving once again that some of history's deepest conflicts do not disappear. They irrigate themselves into everything. And once a conflict has irrigated itself into everything, into canals, kingship, labour, flood, memory, and the watchfulness of omen readers, you finally arrive at the question that hovers over every shelf of tablets, like a patient ghost: how much is actually there? And how much are we adding because we cannot resist a good mystery wrapped in old clay? This is where the night asks you to slow down, not because the subject grows less interesting, but because it grows more delicate. The evidence is real. The questions are real. The temptation to overreach is also very real. Ancient Mesopotamia can make even sensible people start squinting at broken signs, as though the universe hid its customer support policy in cuneiform. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian tablets preserve a staggering range of material myths: hymns, royal inscriptions, legal texts, lexical lists, omen collections, letters, accounts, and prayers. Archaeology suggests that many surviving tablets are fragmentary, context-dependent, and shaped by copying traditions across centuries. The evidence we do have points to extraordinary richness, but also to limits. A broken tablet is not a complete confession. A poetic line is not automatically a coded historical record. A later copy is not the same thing as an untouched original voice. Most historians agree that responsible reading requires patience, context, genre awareness, and the courage to say we do not know without feeling personally betrayed by a lump of baked mud. And yet the lure remains. A careful reading might suggest that some tablets preserve traces of conflict without naming it directly. Administrative texts show pressure. Royal inscriptions show competition. Myths show tension. Divinatory texts show anxiety. One interpretation is that taken together, these genres reveal a culture living inside an unresolved struggle over order, legitimacy, and divine distance. That is a possibility, not a certainty. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the hidden conflict is not one secret narrative buried in one dramatic line, but a pattern that only appears when many kinds of texts are read beside one another? That possibility is more modest than sensational claims, but far more persuasive. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian texts should be read as preserving coherent, long-term theological systems, or as reflecting many local and changing traditions only loosely connected over time. This matters because the idea of a single hidden post-Anunnaki conflict can collapse too much complexity into one neat box. Sumerian religion, like every old and powerful tradition, refuses to behave that neatly. Cities differ, periods differ, genres differ. A king's inscription flatters power differently than a lamentation does. A myth imagines differently than an account tablet records. A divination text interprets differently than a hymn praises. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. And what we cannot confirm is often whether these pieces truly point to one underlying conflict or simply to many overlapping tensions that later readers want to braid together. Still, the braid itself may tell us something. You can think of the tablet corpus as a room full of voices speaking through cracks in the wall. No one voice tells the whole story, but certain themes recur so insistently that they begin to hum. Order must be maintained. Boundaries matter. Labour is heavy. Divine favour is crucial. Kingship needs justification. Catastrophe can reset everything. Signs must be watched. Most historians agree that these are central concerns of Mesopotamian civilization. One interpretation is that their persistence hints at a foundational instability never fully settled. Not a hidden truth in the dramatic modern sense, but a deep civilizational discomfort carried forward by text after text. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply what all early states look like when they become literate enough to worry in writing. That is possible too, and honestly, it is a strong explanation. Any society dependent on complex administration, vulnerable ecology, and sacred monarchy is likely to produce archives saturated with stress. But even then, the atmosphere remains noteworthy. Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts do not often sound like a civilization relaxing into certainty. They sound like one working very hard to secure it. A popular rumour claims scholars are ignoring obvious evidence in the tablets because the truth about ancient divine conflict would be too disruptive. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is very thin. Real Assyriology and ancient Near Eastern scholarship are not perfect, but they are not a grand theatre of synchronised denial. The actual challenge is far less cinematic, and far more annoying damaged texts, linguistic difficulty, uncertain chronology, genre, ambiguity, and the basic fact that ancient literature loves symbolism. The greatest obstacle to certainty is not suppression. It is that the tablets are old, incomplete, and magnificently uncooperative, which to be fair is also why they are so compelling. Archaeology suggests that many tablets survive only as fragments from larger archives, and sometimes even a few missing signs can change a reading significantly. One sign might mean a title, a place, a divine reference, or something maddeningly ordinary. This is why careful scholars stay careful. A fringe idea proposes that especially damaged passages once contained direct references to a continuing divine conflict, now conveniently lost. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is too slight to support it responsibly. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reflects a real frustration. The archive feels close enough to grasp and just incomplete enough to keep the hand open. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the multiplicity of the tablet genres and the recurring themes they preserve. The interpretation is that these patterns may point to a long-lived concern with unresolved order and inherited tension. The imagined part, kept on a short leash, is the feeling that the archive behaves like a half-remembered dream, where every fragment seems to know more than it quite says. So you sit again among shelves of clay, listening to the silence between texts. There is no single smoking tablet waiting to leap into your lap and announce the secret in a voice like a theatre trailer. There are fragments, parallels, recurrences, silences, edits, copies, and moods. There is enough to follow clues, not enough to declare victory. We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. And the clue that matters most here is simple. The archive keeps returning to strain. However you name it, however cautiously you frame it, something in this civilization keeps circling the same anxious centre. Maybe that is the hidden conflict. Not one event, not one code, but one enduring pressure visible only when the texts are allowed to remain many things at once. That enduring pressure is exactly why the more extravagant theories never quite die, when the mainstream evidence keeps circling strain, distance burden, and unresolved order. The imagination begins doing what it does best, putting on a dramatic cloak, lowering its voice and asking whether all of this points to absent watchers, unfinished agendas, or powers that left the stage but not the script. This is the part of the subject where the mist gets thicker, and where we need to walk carefully without pretending the mist is a brick wall. Most historians agree that there is no solid archaeological or textual evidence for modern supernatural claims about the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial rulers, hidden engineers, or departing overlords whose factions still govern history from the shadows. What's broadly accepted is much less sensational and much more grounded. The Anunnaki belong to ancient Mesopotamian religious imagination, and their roles vary across texts and periods. And yet the fringe stories persist because the atmosphere of the real material genuinely invites wonder. A fringe idea proposes that after the Anunnaki withdrew, they left behind rival programs, factions, or principles embedded within human institutions, so that the conflict continued through kings, priests, cities, and inherited systems of control. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is very thin. There is no responsible basis for presenting such a claim as historical fact. Ancient texts do not hand us a clean map of cosmic offices, resignation letters from divine administrators, or meeting notes from a celestial boardroom where somebody forgot to mute themselves. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the fringe theory becomes useful in one narrow way. It dramatizes tensions that are already present in the mainstream record. Those tensions are real enough. The evidence we do have points to a civilization preoccupied with order that must be maintained, authority that must be justified, labour that must be carried, signs that must be read, and catastrophe that must be survived. One interpretation is that modern fringe retellings thrive because they take the emotional truth of that record and over-literalize it. They convert atmosphere into plot. They take a world full of sacred strain and turn it into a story about departed powers whose argument still governs human life. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain the enduring appeal. A puzzle is often more captivating once somebody insists it is a treasure map. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real fascination lies, not in whether the fringe theory is correct, but in why the ancient material makes such theories feel tempting in the first place? A careful reading might suggest that the texts create conditions of suspense. The gods are real within the tradition, but not always transparent. Their intentions can be layered, their relationships complex, their distance from daily suffering difficult to ignore. Human beings inherit structures of duty and interpretation without easy access to certainty. That mood all by itself can generate centuries of speculative storytelling. You do not need flying machines in the footnotes when you already have divine ambiguity, fragile cities, and enough broken tablets to keep the imagination snacking forever. Historians still argue whether modern popular readings of the Anunnaki should be dismissed outright as fantasy or studied more carefully as cultural responses to genuine ambiguities in the ancient record. That debate is worth noticing, not because the ancient astronaut version suddenly becomes persuasive, but because fascination itself is data. People do not repeatedly cling to a theory unless it answers some hunger. In this case, perhaps the hunger is for a single hidden truth that would tidy up a much messier reality. Mainstream scholarship says the evidence is complex. Fringe storytelling says the answer is simple. Human beings, being human, often glance lovingly at the simpler offer before reason drags them back by the collar. Still, reason deserves its due tonight. Archaeology suggests nothing like a secret chain of physical evidence for absent divine rulers continuing their conflict through material remains. There are no confirmed Anunnaki control rooms under temple floors, no official cosmic zoning maps, no safely dated cuneiform memo reading. Please continue factional struggle after departure regards management. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion and myth are products of a real historical civilization grappling with environment, politics, hierarchy, and the sacred. A more cautious explanation could be that modern fringe theories project contemporary anxieties about power surveillance and manipulation back onto ancient texts, because those texts already pulse with concern about authority and burden. That projection is worth pausing over. The hidden conflict may feel modern because hierarchy still feels modern. Distance between rulers and the ruled still feels modern. Systems that outlast the people inside them still feel modern. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki fringe myth survives because it dramatizes a timeless suspicion that the structures directing human life are older, less personal, and less benevolent than they appear. Ancient Mesopotamia did not invent that suspicion, but it gave it magnificent language and unforgettable names. A popular rumour claims scholars secretly know more than they admit about these texts and deliberately soften the truth by calling everything metaphor, ritual, or literary tradition. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence for organised concealment is effectively absent. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is almost transparent. The real situation is duller and better. Many claims are softened because the actual evidence requires caution. Tablets are fragmentary. Meanings shift. Context matters. To be clear, this is debated in detail, not suppressed in darkness. Ancient texts are difficult because ancient people were complex, not because someone hid the exciting page in a locked drawer labelled no fun. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that fringe modern theories about the Anunnaki are not supported by mainstream evidence. The interpretation is that such theories still echo real tensions in the ancient material, especially around power, burden, and distance. The imagined part, kept soft and harmless, is the thought that even if no watchers remain, old names can still cast long shadows, and cultures can go on living inside shapes first traced by gods they no longer experience directly. So you let the fringe smoke drift for a moment and then clear. What remains is still rich enough. A civilization wrestling with order. A body of texts full of strain and wonder. A human habit of turning uncertainty into story. The hidden conflict does not need to be literally supervised by departed powers to matter. It may already be present in the more grounded mystery, how ancient systems of sacred authority continue to echo through the people who inherit them long after the divine actors become names in clay. And once the fringe smoke clears, what remains is not emptiness, but habit. Ritual habit, political habit, emotional habit. The kind of repetition that does not merely preserve a culture, but teaches its people how to feel inside it. This may be one of the most important clues of all. A conflict can survive not because everyone still remembers its first cause, but because they keep repeating the behaviours that were built to manage it. What's broadly accepted is that ritual in Mesopotamia was central to civic and religious life, shaping calendars, temple service, kingship, festivals, offerings, purification, lamentation, and the maintenance of divine favour. Archaeology suggests that ritual was not occasional decoration laid on top of society. It was one of the main ways society remained legible to itself. That means repetition matters. You sweep the temple court, you bring the offering, you recite the line, you mark the date, you join the procession, you observe the fast, the feast, the purification, the lament. The city repeats itself, not because repetition is boring, but because repetition is stabilizing. A careful reading might suggest that ritual habit becomes a human answer to inherited tension. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But in a world where floods happen, kings change boundaries, shift, and signs must be watched, repeated acts offer something priceless rhythm. Rhythm is not certainty, but it can feel close enough to get you through the week. Most historians agree that ritual action in Mesopotamia served to maintain relationships between humans, gods, cities, and rulers. This is mainstream ground. Offerings fed divine images symbolically. Festivals renewed social bonds. Laments responded to catastrophe. Temple service enacted cosmic order in local space. What's broadly accepted is that ritual was not merely expressive, it was operative. People believed it did something. One interpretation is that this doing mattered all the more in a civilization where order felt fragile. If the world can tilt, then repeated sacred action becomes a way of pressing it gently back into place. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if ritual is not only devotion, but memory in motion? Not memory of one neat hidden event, but of a long condition of instability managed through sacred behaviour. The hidden conflict after the Anunnaki in this reading does not survive as a sentence. It survives as a pattern. humans continue performing acts designed to hold together a world whose deeper fracture they may feel without fully naming. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it matches the atmosphere of the evidence rather well. Think about how often ancient texts present proper order as something that can be lost and must be restored. Temples are rebuilt, rites are renewed, kings repair what predecessors neglected, laments mourn ruined cities and seek rebalancing. The evidence we do have points to repeated cycles of disruption and ritual response. Historians still argue whether these cycles should be read primarily as practical statecraft wrapped in religious language, or as genuine metaphysical efforts to sustain cosmic stability. As usual, Mesopotamia cheerfully refuses to choose just one. The practical and the sacred are braided together too tightly to separate without breaking the rope. And habits formed under pressure tend to outlive the pressure's first cause. A more cautious explanation could be that ritual continuity simply reflects the conservatism of ancient religion. People repeat inherited forms because inherited forms are authoritative. True enough. But why do those forms feel so necessary? Why does neglecting them seem so dangerous? Why does restoration language feel so urgent? One interpretation is that behind ritual conservatism lies a deeper social memory. Order is not self-sustaining. It must be fed, enacted, rehearsed. That idea alone can keep a hidden conflict alive, because it teaches each generation that peace is not the normal background of existence. Maintenance is. Archaeology suggests that festivals and temple systems also reinforced hierarchy and political legitimacy, especially when kings took part in public ritual acts. What's broadly accepted is that rulers used ritual to position themselves as rightful maintainers of divine order. A popular rumour claims this means ritual was merely propaganda, a grand old theatre production with incense and better costumes. This theory is not widely accepted in such a simplistic form. Ritual was politically useful, yes, but that does not mean participants experienced it as hollow. Ancient people were fully capable of sincerity and strategy at the same time, which is another way of saying they were people. A fringe idea proposes that rituals preserve traces of procedures once required by absent divine overseers, continuing long after the original authorities had departed. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. There is no reliable textual basis for turning Mesopotamian rites into leftover operating instructions from vanished cosmic administrators. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the fringe version still magnifies something real. Ritual often feels older than explanation. People can keep doing things whose first rationale has faded, because the act itself now carries the memory. A memory carried by the body can be very durable indeed. You can feel that durability in the festival rhythm of the city, torches moving at dusk, priests chanting, offerings arranged with practiced hands, musicians marking time, crowds gathering along familiar routes. Somewhere in the noise and incense is the comforting illusion that everyone knows exactly what they are doing, and why, which, as every human gathering eventually reveals, is never completely true. There is your light joke, but behind it is the deeper point. Shared ritual can hold together uncertainty without resolving it. That may be why it matters so much in a civilization haunted by fragile order. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the central role of ritual in maintaining Mesopotamian civic and divine relationships. The interpretation is that repeated sacred acts may have served as long-term management of inherited instability. The imagined part kept quiet as a late-night breeze through reeds is the thought that every chant and offering carried a faint after-image of an older disturbance, like a cracked vessel lovingly repaired so many times that the repairs become part of its beauty. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. We cannot confirm that any specific ritual existed to suppress memory of a post-Anunnaki fracture. But we can see that Mesopotamian culture treated order as something that had to be reenacted again and again. We can see why that repetition might preserve the emotional shape of conflict long after the original context changed. We can see how habit becomes inheritance. So the city moves through its rituals and the rituals move through the city, and both keep teaching the same quiet lesson. What matters most is not that the world is stable, but that it can be stabilized for one more day. And when a civilization repeats that lesson for centuries, the old hidden conflict no longer needs a name. It has become routine. And routine, once it has hardened into the bones of a civilization, rarely stays confined to its birthplace. It travels forward wearing new crowns, new accents, new temple plans, new imperial ambitions. That is how old tensions survive. History's costume changes. The names shift, the empires widen, the scribal habits evolve, but the deeper patterns remain strangely recognizable. What's broadly accepted is that later Mesopotamian cultures, especially Babylonian and Assyrian ones, inherited and transformed many Sumerian ideas, myths, divine roles, and literary forms. Archaeology suggests continuity across long stretches of time, even amid political upheaval. The evidence we do have points not to a clean break between Sumer and what comes after, but to a long afterlife in which older materials continue to shape newer worlds. So if you are following the hidden conflict, you cannot stop at the early city-states and pat yourself on the back, like a satisfied archaeologist in a movie montage. You have to watch what happens when Sumerian patterns enter larger and more aggressive political frameworks. Kingship grows grander, empires rise, libraries expand, omen literature becomes more elaborate. The old concern with order does not disappear, it scales up. One interpretation is that the conflict continues not by repeating itself exactly, but by changing costume. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But it helps explain why the old anxieties remain legible even when the stage grows much larger. Take Babylon, for instance. Most historians agree that Babylonian scholarship and religion absorbed deep Sumerian inheritance, while also reorganizing the divine landscape in new ways. Myths were reworked, gods were elevated differently, political theology adapted to new centers of power, yet the recurring themes remain familiar: divine legitimation, fragile order, cosmic threat, ritual, maintenance, kingly duty, and the need to interpret signs. A careful reading might suggest that later Mesopotamian culture did not solve the old tensions so much as manage them under new administrations. The hidden conflict after the Anunnaki, if read cautiously, may survive here as a persistent structure of thought rather than a remembered episode. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if departure was never an ending at all, but a shift from immediate divine presence in early sacred imagination to increasingly mediated systems of empire scholarship and ritual? That is speculative, yes, but not reckless if framed properly. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. And one clue is how often later Mesopotamian traditions intensify the machinery of order precisely when political power becomes more expansive. The larger the state, the greater the need to authorize, interpret, and stabilize. Old tensions do not vanish in empire, they become administrative. Historians still argue whether Babylonian and Assyrian religion should be seen mainly as conservative extensions of older Mesopotamian patterns, or as major reinterpretations shaped by new political realities. The answer, once again, is probably both. The continuity is real, but so is the transformation. Marduk rises in Babylon. Ashur dominates in Assyria. Royal ideology becomes more explicitly imperial. Yet beneath those changes, you still find the same old heartbeat order is precious, danger is near divine favour, must be secured, signs must be read, catastrophe remains imaginable. It is like watching a familiar family argument continue at a much larger dinner table with better serving dishes and significantly more armour. Archaeology suggests that Assyrian and Babylonian libraries preserved older textual traditions with enormous care, especially in royal and scholarly contexts. What's broadly accepted is that these archives treated the past as usable authority. Old stories were not dead relics. They were tools, precedents, frameworks, warnings. One interpretation is that preserving old Sumerian material allowed later cultures to keep re-inhabiting unresolved questions without necessarily admitting that they were unresolved. If a text remains sacred or prestigious, it can carry old tension forward under the respectful cover of tradition. A more cautious explanation could be that later Mesopotamian empires simply valued antiquity because ancient prestige strengthened present legitimacy. True enough. But prestige itself often depends on emotional resonance. Why preserve these materials so carefully unless they continue to speak to present needs? Why keep copying and consulting traditions saturated with divine human strain unless those traditions still feel useful for understanding power? The evidence we do have points to a deep continuity of concern, not sameness but recurrence. A popular rumour claims Babylonian and Assyrian elites knowingly carried forward the unfinished agendas of the Anunnaki under new divine names and imperial structures. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. There is no sound basis for turning later Mesopotamian empire into a direct secret continuation office for departed Sumerian gods. But if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it expresses something emotionally plausible. Later systems often inherit unresolved logic from earlier ones. Power changes uniforms faster than it changes instincts. That is why the old conflict may feel strangely modern by this point. The gods become more mediated through bureaucracy, scholarship, ceremony, and imperial display, yet the burden on human communities does not lighten. One interpretation is that the divine distance we have been tracing becomes more systematized in later periods. The world is still sacred, but the sacred now moves through thicker layers of institution. If early Sumer sometimes feels like standing near the source, later Mesopotamia can feel like standing downstream with more officials, more records, and more ways to be told that the order is definitely under control while everyone quietly checks the omens again. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the massive inheritance of Sumerian ideas in Babylonian and Assyrian tradition. The interpretation is that this inheritance may have carried forward unresolved tensions about order, legitimacy, and divine distance. The imagined part, kept soft as lamplight in a library, is the thought that later empires may have lived inside rooms built long ago by Sumerian questions, adding new walls but never moving the foundation. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm one single continuous hidden conflict stretching in a straight line from early Sumer through every later Mesopotamian age. History is too untidy for that. But we can see patterns continuing, deepening, adapting. We can see old anxieties finding new language. We can see why later cultures kept turning back to the same store of myths, signs, and sacred arguments. So the scene widens. The ziggurats change. The capitals move. The kings boast in larger terms. The libraries grow. Yet the old pressure remains in the system, a shadow inside magnificence. And by now it is hard not to suspect that whatever began as tension in the early sacred world of Sumer did not end when the names of the first city-states faded. It learned how to survive in institutions. And institutions, in the end, may be the quietest ghosts of all, not floating spectres in temple corridors, not glowing shapes above the marshes, but systems that outlast the hands that built them and the names that first justified them. By now, after following clay tablets, canal banks, temple storehouses, flood memories, king lists, omens, copied myths, and imperial libraries, you can probably feel where this leaves you, not with one triumphant answer, not with a hidden truth cracked open like a treasure chest. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamia gives us a civilization of astonishing complexity, where religion, politics, labour, environment, and literary imagination are braided together so tightly that pulling on one strand always stirs the others. The evidence we do have points to recurring themes of burden, instability, sacred order, and contested legitimacy. One interpretation is that these themes preserve the afterlife of a conflict that continued long after the Anunnaki seemed to retreat into theological distance. That is a possibility, not a certainty. If you strip away the louder modern claims, what remains is more subtle and in some ways more haunting. A careful reading might suggest that the hidden conflict is the long human experience of inheriting structures whose origins feel divine, whose demands feel earthly, and whose tensions never fully resolve. The gods remain in names, rituals, myths, and authority claims, but the daily labour of maintaining order falls to human beings. Floods still come, boundaries still matter, kings still justify themselves, signs still need reading, ritual still steadies the city. The old argument survives because it has become part of the way the world is organised. Most historians agree that Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts should not be flattened into one coded message. Historians still argue whether the deepest continuity across these traditions is theological, political, literary, or ecological. There is no full consensus, and that is part of the honesty of the subject. We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. And the clues suggest a civilization that never treats order as cheap. Order must be received, assigned, enacted, repaired, defended, and watched. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply what early complex societies feel like from the inside. Even that explanation is meaningful. It still leaves you with a world where strain is normal and where sacred language exists partly to keep that strain from becoming despair. A fringe idea proposes that this long continuity proves literal divine factions continued influencing human history after departure. This theory is not widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. It is thin. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it works best as metaphor. Not a metaphor in the cheap sense of nothing to see here, but metaphor in the deep historical sense. Ancient people knew that power could feel inherited, distant, and difficult to challenge. They knew systems could survive their makers. They knew ordinary people often carried burdens imposed from above. Those truths do not need spaceships to be unsettling. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if the so-called departure of the Anunnaki marks, in cultural memory, the moment when divine order became institution, rather than encounter procedure, rather than presence, duty rather than direct conversation? That is speculative, yes, but it gathers many clues into one calm possibility. The hidden conflict continues because no one ever fully solves the tension between sacred claims and human cost. Every generation inherits it. Every city dresses it in its own clothing. Every ritual soothes it for a while. Every inscription denies it a little too confidently. Even now, you can feel the structure of that old problem in the background of history. Who authorises the order, who benefits from it, and who quietly pays for it? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the rich and layered Mesopotamian record of sacred kingship labour, systems, territorial conflict, flood memory, ritual, maintenance, and divinatory anxiety. The interpretation is that these together may preserve a long after image of unresolved tension, once projected onto the divine world, and then lived out in human institutions. The imagined part offered softly, and only as bedtime mist, is the thought that somewhere in the silence after the old gods seemed less near people kept building their cities, as if the argument had not ended, only changed speakers. And now as the night settles deeper, you can let the city dim a little. The canal is black glass under the stars. The reed beds whisper in their dry, papery way. The ziggurat is only a shape now dark against a softer darkness. Somewhere a lamp burns low in a scribal room, and somewhere else a worker sleeps without finishing his complaint, which is perhaps the most timeless detail of all. The clay tablets remain where they were placed, holding their patient wedges, their lists, their hymns, their kings, their worries. No one tablet gives away the whole secret, and perhaps that is the gentlest lesson. History rarely hands you one answer. It offers a lamp, a fragment, a repeated phrase, and the soft invitation to sit beside uncertainty without fearing it. So you let the old names grow quiet now. Enki, Enlil, the Anunnaki, the kings, the scribes, the labourers, the watchers of omens, the builders of canals. They all drift a little farther out, not gone, just softened by distance. The conflict you follow tonight does not need to be solved before sleep. It only needs to be understood as a human inheritance, the effort of keeping order in a world that never promises to stay arranged on its own. And with that the city exhales. The water moves gently in the dark. The clay cools. The signs stop speaking for a while. You do not need to hold every question awake. You can leave them resting in the mud brick silence, where ancient worries become only texture, only atmosphere, only the faint hum of a civilization, trying its best to remain upright beneath the stars.